where the moon lights.
An excellent day for an exorcism.
I'm your number one fan.
Hey up, how we doing? My name is Scary Zara Mary and this is the Reyt Scary podcast. And if you are new here, what we do on this podcast is we go subgenre by subgenre, looking at horror under a lens. I've already covered Gothic horror as part of my first series. That included a bit of a history of Gothic and where Gothic films come from. I did a deep dive into some of the iconic films from the subgenre, so thinking Nosferatu, Sleepy Hollow, Crimson Peak, The Witch, The Woman in Black. I'm probably forgetting some, The Others. I went into a number of films. Some I did on my own, some I had guests for. And then I rounded off that series by doing a ranking of 30 different Gothic horror films. So if you're wanting to catch up, feel free, go back and listen to those, go back and watch those, especially the ranking one, because I think that'll give you a nice summary of that first chapter. But today we are moving on to a new chapter, which means a new subgenre, and that subgenre is torture. Now, you may have heard this referred to as torture porn or even splatter. I'm going to try and mostly refer to it throughout the series as purely torture. I'll probably refer to it as torture porn in this episode, just for ease and simplicity. And also, I don't want to get flagged on any websites by using that particular term. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to give you an overview of what is torture porn, what are some of the films that we find within it, what's the history of it, and then over the coming episodes I will do, same as we did with Gothic horror, a bit of a deep dive into some of the really iconic films from this subgenre, and again we'll wrap things up with a ranking in a few weeks' time. So I hope that's tempting enough for you to stick around. Let's dig into what is torture porn. Now, I think it's probably easier to start with what it isn't, because there's definitely a couple of things that it is not. So torture porn is not purely sex in horror, and a torture porn film doesn't have to feature any type of sex or nudity. The other thing that it isn't shocking kills, and I think some people think that the term means that a film has to have over the top or bloody or disgusting film. So like I'm wearing my Terrifier top, some people would automatically think Terrifier falls into this subgenre. Actually, I don't think it does. I think it probably falls more into the slasher subgenre, which we are definitely going to cover at some point. And yet all of those things make a part of torture porn as a film, but on their own, it doesn't make that film fall into that subgenre, if that makes sense. But what torture films or splatter films do have is a really, really heavy focus on gore, especially the special effects to create that gore. There is a real focus on the literal destruction and breakdown of the body, as well as the pain that would go with that. And obviously you would have a torturer and someone being tortured, a torturee. But the literal definition of torture is the infliction of intense pain to punish and coerce or afford sadistic pleasure, an anguish of body or mind, to punish or coerce by inflicting excruciating pain, and to cause intense suffering to torment. And with a torture porn film, the way in which they're written, the way in which they're shot, the way in which they're edited is also very key. So it's not just about the gore, the torture, the porn elements. And there was a film critic actually, Michael Arnzen, who stated they typically use manic montages full of subject camera movement, so cross-cutting from hunted to hunter, and an ominous juxtaposition and contrast. Now, we'll get into the films that you would typically see in this subgenre, but like we did with Gothic horror, Let's delve into the history of torture films first and what exactly led to them. Now, torture porn as a term is relatively new. It was coined in the 2000s, which we will come on to, so I'll put a pin in that. Torture as a device, as an action, is obviously much, much older. I actually have this book, which I used in preparation for covering off this subgenre. I didn't buy it especially. I had this anyway. I got it as a Christmas present because that's the type of weirdo that I am. Because I have a weird, macabre interest in torture and pain, hence owning this book, which is, for those listening, this is the Big Book of Torture and Punishment Through History, written by Mark P. Donnelly and Daniel Deal. And this is like an encyclopedia of torture. It's got burning, branding, crushing, smashing, breaking, cutting, piercing, tearing, impaling, restraint, shame, humiliation, stretching, suspension, water, and whipping. Like John Kramer would have an absolute field day with this book. It's so interesting. It goes through the history of torture across the world. It goes through all of the different methods. There's some fantastic pictures of devices that are in there. So if you ever need any inspiration, this is the book for you. So I had a really good flick through that in preparation for this episode. And I learned a lot myself, actually, as I was reading up, and found out that torture actually goes back nearly 7,000 years. Starting in sort of Neolithic Europe, it was used as punishment, but it was also used as part of the judicial process because torture was seen as a way to get the truth out of someone, which I think is how we kind of associate torture in more modern culture. Common methods that we used back then with the rack, which I think most people are familiar with, where you are strapped to some sort of a device and you are stretched. And then also one called the strappado, which is a device where victims' hands are tied behind their back and then they're suspended by a rope attached to their wrists, so usually resulted in dislocated shoulders, and sometimes weights were also added, which is absolutely horrendous. I've got zero upper body strength, especially if my arms are behind my back, so I'd be hopeless at that. There's also the witch trials, so Salem witch trials, but they also took place across various different countries. They took place in the late 17th century. Heavily featured forms of torture in order to test whether a woman was a witch. Completely cruel, horrendous, and ridiculous as well. And most of these punishments took place in public as well. Not just these, but various different types of torture and executions. So could probably be considered the first torture porn, actually. Torture as a form of entertainment. It attracted huge crowds, especially executions, and allowed the community, in a sense, to take revenge on the criminal, the perpetrator, and see that the victim had been given some sort of retribution. And the authorities thought of it as acting as a deterrent to others, which is why they allowed them to be done publicly. I was quite curious as to why would people turn up to public torture and public executions, and really struggled to actually find any real research into this. But I think the answer is probably the same answer to the question, why do people enjoy watching horror, specifically torture horror? And what I did find is that in 1912, there was a Russian physician and psychoanalyst, Sabina Spielrin, and she introduced the concept of death drive. And this theory basically presents a push and pull relationship between both life and death, and it can be applied to viewers of public executions and most likely indeed torture porn. And the theory is that by speculating a violent end of life, in doing so, the thrill of one's own existence is further emphasized. So almost a gratefulness for life. There have been some attempts at studies looking into the psychology of people attending these events. And what they've initially shown is that there are connections between the violence of the torture or the execution that is taking place and then the mood of the crowd. So the more spectacular or violent the torture or death, the wilder and more hyped up the crowd is, which I thought was really, really interesting. And in fact, I did read that when the French decided to introduce the guillotine, the public complained because the act was too clean and too quick, and it was all over and done with, and there wasn't enough mess, and it didn't go on for long enough. So the French wanted to get rid of the guillotine actually when it was first introduced, which I thought was quite funny. I should have worn, I've got a pair of little guillotine earrings. I should have worn them for this episode. Never mind. Now, torture remained legal for a number of centuries, right up until around about the end of the 17th century, in part due to the realization that maybe torture isn't as effective as people had hoped for, especially from the authorities' perspective as a deterrent, but also partly due to prisons in the 18th century being privately owned and these prison owners realizing that they were quite lucrative profit-wise. And so they used imprisonment instead of going for executions and for public displays of humiliation and torture. And what that led to was a form of entertainment quite nicely filling that gap that the public desired. And this is called Grand Guignol, and it's a 19th century French theatre. But Grand Guignol also refers to the type of production that was put on in the theatre, but also in street theatre productions. These were horror plays that featured very gory special effects. An example of one is Le Laboratoire de Hallucination, which features a graphic brain surgery. There's another called Un crime dans une maison de fous, where scissors are used to blind someone, and Le baiser dans la nuit, where a young woman visits a man whose face she disfigured with acid, and he gets his revenge. So it definitely sounds torture porny. And I don't think torture porny is a phrase I should be using. Scratch that. But around the same time, we also saw literature starting to feature some of the elements of torture. And an example of this is Edgar Allan Poe's very, very famous short story from 1842, The Pit and the Pendulum. And this is very effective in inspiring fear through the narrator, describing their experience of being tortured. It was very, very popular, and it led very nicely to cinema, to torture being featured in cinema, mutilations, and the first appearance of gore, a realistic mutilation of human body in cinema, can be traced to not something that I have seen, but it's D.W. Griffith's Intolerance from 1916. It features decapitations and a spear being slowly driven through a soldier's body. And then he created a number of films following a very similar type of theme. But we then sort of fast forward into the modern era. So from the sort of 1920s, we jump forward to the 1950s and 60s, which we can consider as the modern era, where films are portraying gore and violence, but not necessarily torture. Films at that time that had gore were referred to as splatter. So this is before the term torture porn was introduced. And someone called Herschel Gordon Lewis is thought to have directed the first splatter film, which is called Blood Feast, an amazing title. I love that. It came out in 1963. I've added that to my watch list, so I'm going to try and watch that. And splatter films became really, really popular in the 70s, but they were met with very strong reactions, which led to very heavy over the top, if anything, censorship and the outright banning of many splatter films, which were deemed video nasties in British press. And if you want to learn more about video nasties, please go and check out my friend Mr. Sandsman's channel. He's just done an entire series, I think like 4 or 5 episodes on video nasties. He's done this with various guests. He's covered specific films that were in the category 1, category 2 video nasties, and then he's wrapped things up by picking out his favorites from those categories. And I listened to that episode while I was writing my notes for this episode, so a nice link in there. Hi Darren. But like video nasties I find absolutely fascinating. It resulted in so many films through the 70s, the 80s, the 90s needing to adhere to really, really strict censorship. And it wasn't until the late 90s when the BBFC decided to relax its guidelines on video violence that it then allowed films to get uncut certificates. So my favourite film, The Exorcist, after those rules were relaxed, allowed for an uncut version. Same with Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And actually several of the previously deemed nasties were then allowed to be released. And that paved the way to allow so many films combining elements of splatter and also adding in slasher genre films. And they were dubbed torture porn by critics, most notably David Edelstein, who is thought to have coined the term. And the relaxing of the BBFC's terms allowed for films like Hostel and Saw to be released without any cuts. And from 2003 onwards, there were a flurry of torture porn films. So these films most notably feature within the 2000s, sort of from 2003 through to 2009. So I thought it would be good to go through each of the years because there's quite a lot that happens in that decade, with what some of the iconic moments were. Starting with 2004, in the October of that year, Lionsgate released Saw, directed by James Wan, written by Lee Whannell. It's got Cary Elwes. He's a kidnapped oncologist, and he is instructed that he must murder a fellow abductee, played by Lee Whannell, or his wife and daughter are going to be killed. And eventually he hacks off his own foot to escape. So if you've not seen Saw, sorry about the spoiler, but I'd hope that most people would have seen it. And I think most people would consider Saw to be like the grandfather of torture porn, as it were. But the movie itself isn't particularly gory. And Lee Whannell himself actually said that it's more of a thriller. And he said that it's two guys that are just desperate to get out of a room, and every now and then we cut to the outside of the room to show you what a bad guy is up to. I think the film got that label from the sequels as they got more and more gory, which I think is fair. And actually, I'm going to be doing an episode on the Saw franchise as a whole. So keeping it quite surface level and talking about the development of the franchise. But then I am going to do a deep dive on Saw in particular because I think that sits very differently to the rest of the films. Then we move on to 2005. And after the success of Saw, we see Eli Roth's Hostel. This is about people who pay to torture and kill strangers. And then we've also got Rob Zombie's The Devil's Rejects. It's got 3 serial killers in there. And then we also have Wolf Creek, which is about a serial killer based in the outback in Australia and played by John Jarratt. Now, 2006 is a little bit quieter, but we have a Saw sequel in there, of course, because they decided to release annual films. And then there was also a film called Turistas. It's got Josh Duhamel in there, and it's about backpackers in Brazil who are captured by organ harvesters, kind of along the same lines as Wolf Creek, but not quite. And then in 2007, we get even more extreme horror. So we've got French films like Inside and Frontiers, and then we've also got Eli Roth's sequel to Hostel, Hostel 2. And then in 2008, throughout the 2000s, torture porn was given a huge boost by New French Extremity films, is what they're referred to. Really known for their very, very brutal nature. Martyrs is one of them. I've already mentioned Frontiers and Inside, but Martyrs I am going to be covering on this podcast as well. And then in 2009, what we start to see is that torture porn films are still being released, but actually we have a new wave, a new trend, particularly in the US, where we see remakes and reboots of earlier horror films. So you've got things like Dawn of the Dead, Amityville Horror, House of Wax, Black Christmas, Halloween, My Bloody Valentine, Friday the 13th, The Wolfman, The Crazies, A Nightmare on Elm Street. But the other thing that we do see in this year is a very obscure film, and I think it became a bit of a meme in itself. It's still a meme now. Tom Six's The Human Centipede. And this is about a crazy scientist who stitches 3 people together, mouth to anus. Yeah, I won't be covering this film on my podcast. I'm sure I'll talk about it at some point. I've seen it a couple of times, to be fair, but I'm not going to be delving into The Human Centipede. But it's a very interesting film, I will say that. In the same year, we get the release of Saw 6. So like I said, they are banging out those sequels. But we also get Lars von Trier's Antichrist. So this has got Willem Dafoe in it. Very, very controversial. I listened at the weekend to a podcast that I listen to is Louis Theroux, and he was interviewing Willem Dafoe and in particular talking about this film. Willem Dafoe talking about how controversial it was at the time, a little bit uncomfortable talking about it. Definitely one that I need to go back and rewatch at some point, maybe through my fingers. And then as we're coming to sort of the end of this decade, I'm not going to mention this many times, I promise, a Serbian film is released. And I really struggled to talk about this film. It depicts the rape of a newborn child. And when it was put forward to the British Board of Film Classification, they demanded 49 or 50 different cuts to be made to the film. The filmmakers stated that a Serbian film is intended as an allegory about Serbia itself. But the board said that the images they recognise are intended to shock, but the sexual and sexualised violence goes beyond what is acceptable under current guidelines. I'm going to put a pin in a Serbian film, and I'm going to come back to it later on. It's worth touching on a couple of things regarding that film. What else we do see in this year? Again, we get another Saw film, Saw 3D. It opens huge reception, opens at number 1 in North America, but it is dwarfed by a different film, and that is Paranormal Activity 2, one of my favourite paranormal films, which suggests that audiences are getting a little bit tired of brutality in horror, and the Saw franchise is actually put on ice at that point until 7 years later when Jigsaw releases. And then in 2011, a few things happen that definitely signify sort of the end of this torture porn era. So James Wan and Lee Winnell, who worked together on Saw, they come back together, but this time go with a very, very well-received popular ghost tale, and that is Insidious. And then the other thing that happened that year is that the British Board of Film Classification refused to issue a certificate allowing Human Centipede 2 to go to DVD. And finally, the death toll for torture porn is officially rung when Hostel Part 3 goes straight to DVD. It doesn't even get a cinematic release. So that is kind of a bit of a whirlwind tour of this torture porn era in the 2000s. I did mention I wanted to put a pin in a Serbian film. I don't necessarily want to talk about this film, in all honesty, because I'm not a fan of it in the slightest. But I know that some people are a fan. I know that some people would expect it to be talked about as part of this series, so I think it'd be strange for me to not reference it. I'm going to be very, very honest in my feelings towards the film. And I will say up front, I think people who say that it's one of their favourite horror films are just edgelords. I'm not on board either with people who critique horror fans who refuse to watch it. That's been said before. I've seen it said to horror fans who say, I'm not watching it, I'm not interested. Other people have kind of clapped back and said that they're not a proper horror fan. I think that is absolute nonsense. And the reason why I wanted to mention a Serbian film is I want to talk about the topic of rape very, very briefly, especially in horror, because it's a really complex, it's hotly debated topic, rightly so. 1 in 5 women will be raped at some point in their life. And that's as per the CDC. That's not me making up stats. You can go and check it. If you know any women at all, you probably know someone whose life has been affected by rape. And even women who haven't directly experienced rape live every single day with the knowledge that that might change at any moment. And regardless of your age, there are social rules that you have to follow to avoid being kidnapped, murdered, harassed, assaulted, or raped. And rape, whether it's fictionalized or whether it's real, is deeply resonant with us as humans, and it's been part of cinema since inception. Films like Birth of a Nation in 1915, Gone with the Wind in 1939. These are periods when marital rape was legal. And I recognize that things are very, very different today. You know, that's not to say that depictions of rape on screen haven't evolved in the past 100 years, because we have films where sexual assault was either implied off screen or gratuitously depicted without any sort of follow-up in the films before the mid 1970s. So Rosemary's Baby, Peeping Tom. And kind of in the run-up to torture porn, there was definitely a subgenre that emerged which could be referred to as rape revenge. It's very closely linked to torture porn. So if you think about films like I Spit on Your Grave from 1978, it's a film where a young journalist tracks down and brutally murders the 4 men who gang raped her, widely regarded as a rape revenge film. And some people would actually regard it as a torture porn film as well. And the reason why I mention all of this is because I am purposely excluding some films from this little chapter that I'm going to be covering off, because it's my belief some rape scenes are absolutely necessary in film, but some films are unnecessary and they are thrown in for shock value or even for sexual gratification. Now, cinema is a show don't tell medium, and what that means is if a rape is integral to a character's arc, to their storyline, to their development, to their background, then there might be some sort of narrative justification for a rape scene. But it's possible to create a well-done survivor character without showing her rape. And poorly written rape scenes in films are, at best, dismissive of one of the most harrowing experiences a person can have. And I suppose all of this is a very, very long-winded way of saying, like I said, don't expect me as part of this series or any future episodes to cover a film that features gratuitous rape or sexual assault scenes unless that assault is integral to a character's background. That probably leads me quite nicely on to talking about some of the films that fall into this subgenre after my little rant, and I hope you stuck with me. Now, these films you might have heard of, some you might not have. One that I have already mentioned is Saw. So it's one of the key drivers through the 2000s. We've got Saw 1 right through to Saw X, and apparently we are getting Saw 11 at some point. You've also got Hostel, like I mentioned, parts 1, 2, and 3. We've got Wolf Creek 1, 2, the TV series, and we are getting a third one as well, coming very soon. Martyrs, I mentioned, definitely going to be covering that on the podcast. You've got The Collector and The Collection. And I think there is a third film coming out, but I can't remember what the name is. Collectibles? I don't know. Collector, Collection, Collective, Collectibles. I'm not sure. Those films anyway. I'm relatively new to The Collector, actually. I only watched it a couple of months ago. Serbian film, like I mentioned. I Spit on Your Grave. The Loved Ones. Audition. Frontiers, another French extremist film. American Mary. Hard Candy. Fantastic film featuring Elliot Page. Would You Rather? Again, I think it's a massively underrated one, probably not a popular one when it comes to this subgenre, but one that I really love, and I think it's a lot of fun, if that's okay to say about a torture porn film. And then you've got other films like the Hills Have Eyes franchise, you've got the Human Centipede franchise, Last House on the Left, and Violation. And when I ask people on socials, which ones are your favourite torture films? Obviously, Saw and Hostel were mentioned along with Wolf Creek and Martyrs. So yes, I am going to be delving into those as well as a couple of others, like I mentioned. Some I'm going to do on my own and some I'm going to do with guests. I'm excited that I'm not going to be talking about gothic horror and I get to delve into something that's a little bit grimy and a little bit sticky. And some of these films, like I have to say, torture porn probably isn't my favourite subgenre, but some of the films that sit within this subgenre are some of my favourite films, if that makes sense. I love Saw. I love it. Some people can't stand the franchise. They love the earlier kind of episodes within the franchise, but not so much the latter. I don't fall out with that. I love Hostel. I'm a big fan of Eli Roth's work, and I'm looking forward to actually going back and rewatching Hostel to see if it holds up. Martyrs, I watched once many, many years ago, and I've pretty much entirely forgotten it. So that's going to be an interesting one to go back to, definitely. And like I mentioned, there's a few underrated ones in there that I've thrown into the mix just because I love them and I think I'd like to bring more attention to them. So yes, that is torture porn in a nutshell. It's going to be a bit of a learning curve, like I said, just because this isn't my favourite subgenre. But I think talking about these films might make me love it even more. And I hope you love it too. I'd be really, really interested to hear your thoughts on the torture porn subgenre. So please do drop a comment into this episode, and I try and reply to every single comment, and I'd love to have a conversation about which your favourites are. Maybe one that I haven't even mentioned, like I say, because I am not au fait with this subgenre like I am others. And feel free to come and give me a follow on my socials as well. So I'm at Reyt Scary on YouTube and Instagram, and I'm at Scary Zara Mary on TikTok, Instagram, Blue Sky, Threads, and Letterboxd. So you can follow along on all of those. You can come and drop me a comment or a message and keep me up to date. If you want to watch along some of these films while I'm reviewing them, that would be interesting. But yeah, I'm really excited to get stuck into these. I think it's going to be different. I'm excited to see, especially the practical effects side of things. But mostly, I look forward to talking to you about these films. So I will leave it there for this week. I'll see you with you then. I'll see you soon.
They're coming to get you, Barbara.
I guess everyone's entitled to one good scare, huh?
I'll be right back.
Game over. It's all for you.
Beware the moonlights.
An excellent day for an exorcism.
I'm your number one fan.